The Iran deal is signed, and here in Switzerland the work is supposed to begin. That not everyone is celebrating. One senior Republican called this the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. On paper, the United States and Iran have just 60 days to find a nuclear agreement.
So what will be the Pentagon's mission focus if and when these talks resume? How does a ceasefire like this work? It's already been interrupted by fighting in Lebanon. We use an acronym called DIME: diplomatic, information or intelligence, military and economic. And it's those four levers that need to be pulled for any successful negotiation.
After 4 months of war, many think Iran has gained the upper hand. What about the missiles, the proxies, the extraction of the uranium? Will that be part of the negotiation? Welcome to the Art of the Deal. This is the Security Brief. Hello everyone, we're in Switzerland for the beginning of the Iran talks. We're in the foothills of Burgenstock, the mountain resort where it's supposed to take place. It's 3,700 feet up that mountain into the sun. We can't just see it this morning. We're here.
We are, no one else is. But the idea was for the Iranians, the Vice President J.D. Vance, the Pakistanis and the Qataris to turn up for what has been posited as the day one of the negotiations in advance of this 60-day period that was agreed by the Memorandum of Understanding.
The Iranians postponing because they don't like Israel's ongoing operations in Lebanon, which we'll come to. But we were here in Switzerland just 112 days ago for the talks in Geneva. It was Friday the 27th of February. We left Friday night. By early Saturday morning, the war was underway with that attack on the Supreme Leader's compound.
Yeah, and during those talks in Geneva, I think it's probably good to take a step back and look at what the Trump administration was concerned with. They were talking about predominantly the imminent threat of Iran's ability to develop a nuclear warhead, but not just that. The implication of the rhetoric was also that they would actually use it. They were talking about the threat of Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, in southern Lebanon, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. They were talking about the threat of Iran's ballistic missile program, the biggest in terms of volume and most diverse in the region. But also there were many overtures during the January protests of tens of thousands being killed, and sort of trying to persuade the Iranian people to rise up against the government, if you like, which is effectively tantamount to regime change. Now, I think we've got some video here of Trump sending out his aims on February the 28th, which is day one of Operation Epic Fury. Take a listen.
We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon.
And as you can hear from that soundbite from Trump there, Christian, there was also talk of targeting Iran's naval capacity.
Okay, so they were the implied objectives at the beginning of Epic Fury, but within a week, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth were bending the focus of the campaign.
Yeah, they were. And what came out of that was more objectives aligned to what I would call military objectives rather than political objectives. So there was now talk from Secretary of State Rubio on targeting the Air Force, targeting naval capacity, ballistic missiles still, but ballistic missile and drone launchers, not the entirety of the program. And the final one was the defense industrial base. And the reason for that is that the Trump administration learned pretty quickly that they could only achieve so much with air power, and the next big step in order to achieve those political objectives would have relied on boots on the ground.
But let's be clear, there was no talk at that point of the Strait of Hormuz.
Absolutely zero talk whatsoever, and this needs to be driven home. There was no talk of the Strait of Hormuz, and it turns out that actually it's become Trump's Achilles heel.
Okay.
But we'll talk about the Strait a little bit later.
Let's bring it back to the diplomacy. 4 months on, and the MOU signed at Versailles on Thursday night, with President Macron looking on, and an enormous backlash suddenly among hawks in Donald Trump's own party. Why? What is it they don't like?
Well, firstly, the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, is 2 pages long. Just to contrast that with the Joint Contingency Plan of Action under the Obama administration, that was 160 pages long. So you can see the level of detail in one versus the other to begin with. It's a skeleton, effectively, an outline of the negotiations to come over this 60-day period. But it doesn't go any further to where we were when we were talking about this 112 days ago back in Geneva. In fact, it gives to the Iranians more, notably a waiver to sell oil, which they didn't have in February. It doesn't mention the ballistic missile program, which is a persistent threat to Israel. It doesn't mention the proxies, which are a persistent threat to the region and beyond. And it leaves effectively the regime in place. I mean, you might tell us that two versions of the regime have been removed, but many of the same people are still in place. And if you look at what the definition of regime change is, that includes the IRGC, not just the IRGC, the networks that are involved with
the security network.
The Basji forces, for example.
Yeah.
It involves the police, and it involves the judiciary, and it involves the theocracy, all of which remain extant.
And oddly, no cap on military capability, which ordinarily in other negotiations is a key part of the talks. I mean, look at the negotiation over Ukraine and what President Putin is demanding. Which brings us to intelligence. What intel do we have on the current state of the nuclear program?
Again, I think we've got to roll back and just have a look at, what was being said by the Trump administration after Operation Midnight Hammer back in 2025, which targeted Iran's nuclear facilities. It was unequivocal. Trump and Hegseth came out after that operation and basically declared that Iran's nuclear enrichment program had been, quote unquote, obliterated. And we heard that word obliterated used on numerous occasions.
And not just Trump and Hegseth.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't just Trump and Hegseth, in fairness. Iran said that the nuclear installations have been badly damaged. And the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, agreed that there had been significant damage done to the infrastructure of the three nuclear sites, specifically the centrifuges, which are critical to the enrichment process.
But then fast forward to Geneva and the talks we went to, and the run-up to Operation Epic Fury, and the President and his Defence Secretary then telling us that Iran is close to delivering a nuclear weapon. In fact, the implication was that the regime was prepared to build it and to use it.
Yeah, and that to use it bit is really important, because if you rewind to March 2025, the then director of the National Intelligence in the US, Tulsi Gabbard, under oath said, quote, the IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003. So that point on intent also didn't exist.
Yeah, but they do have 440 kilos of enriched uranium, up to 60%, and it's still there.
Yeah, weapons grade being 90%. I think it's important to say that the enrichment to 60% occurred when the JCPOA was ripped up by the Trump administration in 2018.
And you've got to get access to it, because there is intelligence that these tunnels might have been booby-trapped, they might have been covered up.
Well, there is intelligence saying that the Iranians have booby-trapped the tunnels, have collapsed the tunnels, which all points to access to it. So even getting boots on the ground, how would you get access to it, and what would be the equipment required in order to get access to it?
Can we talk about the delivery systems? What intel do we have on the ballistic missile program, which again, Hegseth says has been obliterated?
Yeah, well, here he is again, Donald Trump at the G7. He started telling reporters this. Take a listen.
No, I'm saying that if other countries have them, it's a little bit unfair for them not to have some. A ballistic missile is not the same thing as what we're talking about when we talk nuclear. But if Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and they all have some, I would say in relative proportion, I think it's okay. That's what I mean.
So from that, really, what you can take away is that the truth is we really don't know a lot about the capability of these ballistic missiles and where they're stored. I mean, we're hearing things like missile cities, huge, vast underground complexes that actually contain way more ballistic missiles than was anticipated, but also getting to them, they're under granite, which even can't be targeted by the massive ordnance penetrator, the 30,000 bomb that the US have that they dropped from the B-2. So I think there's been a huge miscalculation by the US on just what is left.
Okay, so that brings us to the military, which is useful because we've got 2 military helicopters that have just arrived over the resort, which tells me they are still prepping for some arrivals, perhaps overseeing the routes. Let's talk about the military, though, that is in the Middle East at the moment, specifically the US deployment. What do they do with that now that we're into this 60-day period?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of elements of what US military will remain behind. We covered the build-up extensively on the security brief prior to February the 28th, and there is a significant amount of US capability in the region. Just going back to the intelligence conversation, the US will want to keep eyes on those nuclear facilities, and they're going to need capability to do that. What they'll remain or have in region that are critical to assessing that intelligence are the MQ-9 Reaper drones. 20 plus have been lost. They're a $30 million asset, and 20 have been lost or shot down during the campaign. You've also got the MQ-4C drone. It's a slightly bigger drone, more intelligence capability. That's around 60 million a pop. One of those has gone missing. But then you've got what's called geo-intelligence. That comes from the satellites, or as Donald Trump calls it, the
space cameras.
The space cameras, which is a term I've not actually heard before. So ideally, you need a network of also human intelligence, that human we talk about, and that'll be informants on the ground to get eyes on. But lastly, and this is important, is the RC-135 rivet joint. That's a large aircraft that can listen into communications.
Really, if you were to look at what leverage he has, though, it probably is only that threat to return to bombing if the Iranians don't show up.
Yeah, so we've got the intelligence piece, but also Donald Trump is talking about the ability to return to bombing straight away. And because the negotiations seemingly have broken down already on day 3, that sort of 60-day window that Trump's talking about in terms of going back to bombing, that's been reduced significantly by what's just happened. But what will allow Donald Trump and his administration to do that are the B-52 strategic and B-1 Lancer strategic bombers that are forward deployed to RAF Fairford in the UK. So I think that you'll either see those assets remaining, or certainly the infrastructure at Fairford remaining to allow them to forward deploy quickly in order to do that bombing campaign.
What about the deployment of US troops?
Yeah, US troops, again, massive build-up. We saw 82nd Airborne coming into theatre. There's a 160th Special Operations Regiment and associated special forces. Along with that, we saw the USS Tripoli coming in from Asia and the Amphibious Ready Group with about 2,500 Marines on. That, incidentally, is now heading back to Asia. But
that's gone back.
That's heading back, yeah. But there's a big question on, what happens to the 82nd Airborne, and certainly we'll be monitoring on security brief troop capability that remains in theatre, although the idea of putting troops on the ground in this 60-day period, I think, will be a decision that the Trump administration won't take lightly.
It leads us to the proxies, Lebanon and Hezbollah. Yeah. The fighting has continued this week. The Lebanon ceasefire is part of the MOU. Iran insists it must be part of the negotiation, and they've cited it as the reason Friday that they've not showed up here. Yeah,
so the MOU says, quote, termination of military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon being the critical point here. The United States signing up to that, though, is remarkable in many ways, as it could be seen as a rejection of Israel's ongoing concerns relating to Hezbollah.
It is remarkable to me, the peace, or the lack of a peace on the proxies, because for years we've talked about Iran's support for Hamas, which led to the war in Gaza. We've talked about, for years, the Shia Crescent, the axis that stretches from Tehran through Damascus to Beirut.
The Shia Crescent.
And we've talked about the Houthis and the threat in the Red Sea to world trade. Are we really saying that the Americans no longer care about that?
Well, remarkably, we heard Trump talking about Syria going into Lebanon this week to restore order, which I think is
equally remarkable when you think how long Syria were in Lebanon.
30 years. And it took Lebanon 30 years to get rid of Syria. So there's no denying that the proxies are much weaker, for sure, across all three that we've just mentioned. But Assad is gone, and Tehran is much weaker as a result of that fragmentation. But the theocracy in Iran survives, and so do the tentacles, which threaten the region. And the absence of proxies in the MOU, which is significantly important, will concern Jerusalem greatly, I think.
Let's finish on the economy. Since the MOU was signed in Versailles on Thursday night, ships have begun to move again, but we're a long way short of the 130 a day that were moving through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, estimates put a $250 billion hit to the global economy based on the freezing of tankers going through the strait. So the effect of removing that blockade will be immediate. Not to mention the restoration of all of the critical things that were coming out of there. So, we're not just talking about oil, we're talking about liquefied natural gas, we're talking about fertilizer. That was something that was massively underestimated, and also helium as well. So, the long-term effects that I think it's important is that isn't going to recorrect itself straight away. It's going to be a long time in coming.
What has angered a lot of Republicans and indeed anti-regime figures in Iran is that the sanctions on Iranian oil have already been lifted. The waivers are in place.
Yeah, and this puts the absolute impetus by the US on the Strait of Hormuz, seemingly giving Iran a reward instantly for opening that Strait of Hormuz, which is, a most durable economic lever before even the hard part of the negotiations have even commenced. I think it's really important to note that 90 to 96% of Iranians' export comes through Karg Island. We did a whole piece on Karg Island. And what's important about that is that money is critical to the IRGC and its networks to fund its defense industrial base, but also to conduct operations.
The text also says that Iranians will get access to frozen funds, which is $24 billion or more, upon the implementation of the MOU. That suggests the money can start flowing well before the follow-on agreement is negotiated.
Yeah, and also there's this idea of this $300 billion fund for reconstruction of Iran and its economic development.
Which he said didn't exist, but it's there in black and white in the text.
Yeah, and it absolutely does exist. And the irony for me, Christian, on all of this, when it comes to the impetus that's going to put on the regional actors, is the US starts destroying Iran. Iran responds by destroying its neighbours, and now the US is now asking Iran's neighbours to front the bill.
Yeah, the Arab leaders that were at the G7 who were sat alongside Trump this week gave a pretty mooted response to that, but you can understand their frustration.
Yeah, I totally can. And, whether it comes to lifting sanctions on the oil or this $300 billion fund, the big thing for me militarily, joining it to the economic piece on dime, is that there now will be money flowing back into the IRGC coffers and its networks. So, when I sort of try and distill it all down into one, you've effectively got a situation where the US has started bombing Iran. Iran has responded by bombing its neighbors. And now the US is expecting its neighbors to front the bill for the economic reconstruction of Iran. It reminds me of what the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu said, who said that tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I think, sadly, this is what we're seeing here.
Sun Tzu in the sun. Mikey, thank you as ever for that. We'll continue to follow this through the next 60 days, although you'll struggle, I think, to find an analyst that will tell you it will be done in 60 days, and we're off to a pretty inauspicious start today. We'll see where it goes this weekend. Thank you for watching. Just a reminder that all the back episodes of SB are on the YouTube website. The QR code is on the screen, and don't forget to send us your questions. The address is security.brief@bbc.co.uk. We'll see you next time.